Welcome everyone, my name is Tim Burris and today we're going to talk about preventing your Startup.cs from becoming a big ball of mud, or if it already has become a big ball of mud, how can you untangle it? So in today's demo, the architecture for the project that I have looks like this. We have a web application, and that web application uses a business layer. And inside of that business layer are a whole bunch of services that are going to need to be registered. A whole auto mapper layer for mapping models between the business and data layer. SMTP for mailing, sending emails, SMTP. And Azure connection information for Azure storage. And then also, this business layer uses the data layer, and in that data layer we have a bunch of repositories that need to be registered, and of course we have a database connection string that we're going to need to get into this layer. So let's look at some code. So here is a copy of my startup that I made that kind of shows what registering all these services might look like if you don't separate things, if you just do it all in one Startup.cs, kind of making your startup a big ball of mud. So at the top we'll see some adding of modules, some adding of third-party packages like Toast and Blazored Modal and all that stuff. And but as we go down, we'll start to see some of our own services. We'll register some local services. This is where we're setting up our identity for user authentication and authorization. And then we start registering all of our business layer services. So a bunch of business layer, continued. This is where we'll get some settings from our configuration that we're going to need in our business layer. The Azure storage connection string, the SMTP information, we get that from configuration. And then we get into our data layer registrations and all of our repositories, generic repositories, and we just keep going on, a bunch of services. And also in here is our connection string that we get from configuration, and we configure our database factory using that connection string. Now this is fairly organized. It's broken into different sections where we have data and business, and we could create individual functions or methods, I should say, in Startup to help organize. Or I see some people wrap this in regions, so that it's a little bit more clear. But ultimately, we don't need, or we don't want all of this stuff inside of Startup. What we really want to do is follow a pattern like we see some other packages follow, where we simply had something like add and then what we want to add, and then that's responsible for doing all the work. So if instead of just one big startup, we break this down a bit, let's look at how I actually implement it. And like I prefer to do in most of my videos, I'm using real code here that I've written that's out in the wild. So it's imperfect. There's there's commented out code. There's plenty of things in here that could be improved. But I like for you guys to see what it really looks like in the real world, not a sample that has been carefully manicured and thrown together. So this is what it really looks like. So what we'll see in this version of the startup is we still have a bunch of code for things that are related to our web project, and that's what we expect. This Blazored, Toast, and Modal. All this is related to our web project, and we expect all of that to be in our startup. We are still going to have to get our SMTP configuration settings from the configuration file. In our case, the app settings. But the first thing we'll see here is the identity references registration has been moved into an add homegrown identity. So if I just look into that guy, it's just an extension method that accepts my service collection and the reference to configuration, and then it registers. So this would be everything related to identity. Registers some services and reads some settings. That one's pretty straightforward and simple, but where it really starts to get pretty powerful is the business layer. So all those services for business layer and data layer are gone. None of that is in here. The only stuff we have in here are things that are related to the web application itself. And then when it comes to the business layer, this is our registration for the business layer. So we are going to use this add business layer. We're going to get our settings out of the config file, out of the app settings file, and we're going to pass those into this initialization routine as a delegate. So we'll pass in this, and whenever the business layer asks, these will be the settings we're going to use. So our SMTP, Azure, database connection, all that stuff will be specified here. So we'll dive into what that extension looks like. So when we go to the add business layer, we'll see that we accepted a delegate of a configuration object. So I'll just go ahead and show what that guy looks like, and we'll control tilde to split that screen so we can see it a little bit. Let's collapse that. So we accept in our configuration and we have the properties on there that we need to set up our business layer. Now on the flip side, we could actually just accept in an iConfiguration here. I don't have it here. Let me see if I can. Yeah, Microsoft. So I could just inject the configuration here and then read it from the configuration, and that's absolutely a viable option. I prefer not to be dependent on the configuration because sometimes I'm using this from Xamarin Forms or from other places where maybe I don't have an app settings, or you can still get an app settings, but I actually prefer to just pass in the raw values and let the web application be responsible for how it knows where those settings are. But so for now, we're just going to strip this back out, and we'll go with our extension method, which is off of our service collection, accepting in our delegate of config. We go through, we register all of our services, register a bunch of services. Then we get down, register some singletons, and then we create a new instance of our configuration, and that was that configuration object we were just looking at, and we call invoke on our delegate, passing in this new instance of configuration. So any defaults or such that we would want our configuration, we would set right in here. So let's say that by default the let's see, what might we set? I mean, none of these really make sense for defaults, which is why there are no defaults. But if we had a default Azure connection string, we would set it there. Then we would call our delegate config and let it do an invoke. And if the caller, the web application in this case, wanted to override that connection string, then they would override it. So that's kind of what's happening here. But as we move on further in the code, now we'll see. So we've added AutoMapper, and then this is where we set up our data layer. So the same kind of pattern. We've called the business layer. It's initialized, and now it's going to call the data layer because the web application doesn't actually know anything about the data layer and shouldn't know anything about the data layer. It's the business layer that knows about this guy. So while we did have to expose the fact that we do indeed need a database connection string, that's really all the web knows about the data layer. It doesn't know anything else. So when we jump into this guy, so we have our data layer, we have our delegate asking for connection string, and this current user provider is just a technique for letting the data layer know who the current user is, so that when updates are made to the database, it'll be able to stamp it with created by user ID and updated by user ID. But that's way out of the scope of this video, so I'm going to rein it in a little bit. So let's jump into the data layer, and this is going to look just like what we saw in the business layer, which is that add data layer is off of the services and takes in a delegate of configuration. Now this configuration will be specific to the data layer, so we are going to move this guy over there, and we'll just close the business one. And you can see the only thing that he needs are a connection string, as we talked about, the type that will provide us the current user. And so when we see this data layer, bunch of services being registered, the same deal here. we create an instance of configuration, and if we had any defaults, we would assign them right here. And then ultimately we invoke our delegate, passing in our instance of configuration, which allows the calling code to override any of the default settings we might have set. And then we finish out our registrations. If we look at our Solution Explorer here, just so we can see, here's how the project breakdown is. As you might expect, a business folder with all of our business projects, our services here in business, all there. Our contracts or abstractions are here. And then I like to create this project called the Bootstrapper. And this is where I like to do my tying of my services to my abstractions. This is the guy who's responsible for saying these interfaces are implemented by these services. So that's where you'll find this business layer extension that we were just looking at is inside this Bootstrapper. Now, if this is just too much project separation, absolutely just move this guy into your business library right here. And the same thing for the data. We have our data, abstractions, our models, and we have our Bootstrapper here. And the same deal. If this is just too much for you, if there's just too many projects, absolutely, you could just move this guy into the data library and let it live right there. And the other really great thing about this kind of architecture, where the business layer has a responsibility for initializing himself, is while I don't expect to ever need this in anything other than this web application right here, I think we've all run into those situations where you might want to reuse this layer, even if it's temporary, where or maybe you have a new desktop app and you want to use it. But I mean, those situations are rare. But what's more common is I find myself in this situation where the client has said, "Oh man, I've got this Excel spreadsheet. I really want you to bring all this data in." And while you can do that directly in the database, maybe your current situation is, man, I could use closed XML to parse this Excel sheet. And if I just had access to my repositories, my data layer, I could import that sheet in no time and have all of my repo logic or even the business layer logic applied. Well, what do you find yourself doing is going to this Startup.cs, this one here, the nasty one, the big ball of mud, and you find yourself trying to pick out all the registrations here that you need. You put that into your console app that's going to be kind of a one-time or a single-use kind of application, and you're trying to force your console app to have the ability to initialize the data layer. But if you've already abstracted it out so that it's responsible for itself, one, you get a much cleaner startup here, and two, you can actually reuse the layer and initialize it with a simple call. I say a simple call. Yes, it's a simple. You do have to get the settings, but in your console app, maybe if you're only going to use the data layer, you're going to go directly to the data layer. Then all you're going to need is the connection string, and you can just hard code it in, for your one time, and then you can go on about your day. So yes, it is going to clean up your startup a bit, but even more importantly, it's going to separate things out kind of the way they should be. So while this is not revolutionary here, I'm not presenting you with something that no one has ever thought of before. What I do see is this startup is almost always what I encounter in the wild. Every project nearly that I jump on, this is what's happening. All the different layers, all the different services are all registered in one big startup. And I'm advocating that you split it up into sections that make sense, and then you can actually come in and read your startup and kind of have an idea about what's going on. And while what we've spoken about just now was only for registering dependencies, so that's under the convention .add, which is in .NET Core where you would expect to register your dependencies, you would follow the same pattern for the things that need to happen after your dependencies are registered. So while that's in configure services, when you're trying to add third parties, after your dependencies are registered and you want initialization code to fire, you would typically see the convention of use. So this would be off your app builder. You would follow the same kind of pattern. So here again, my identity stuff has a use homegrown identity. So this is the work that needs to be done after dependency injection has been set up. And it looks like for my identity, I need to use cookie policy, authentication, authorization. Now these are off of Microsoft extensions, but because that's part of my whole identity, then I'm putting it inside this homegrown identity extension. And similarly, I'll see my business layer, which also has some initialization that needs to fire after dependency injection. And a lot of times you don't. A lot of times you do not need these use for your features. You just need dependency injection. But when you do, you would follow the same pattern. So for my business layer, using AutoMapper, there's something that I needed to set up for AutoMapper, and also it looks like data layer has some initialization that needs to happen after the dependency injection is set up as well. Oh yeah, so that's my date stamper, similar to how my Petapoco micro ORM repository handles stamping changes like updated by and created by. It also has a date stamper, so it'll add created by and updated dates. But again, that's a whole separate video. The point being, this is initialization code that needs to happen after the dependency after the dependencies have all been set up. And so you just follow the same kind of pattern, just these are for your use feature versus your add dependency. So take a little time, break up your Startup.cs, and as your project grows, it will really begin to pay off. I appreciate you taking the time to join me. Have a wonderful day.